The bar door groaned open, and a thin blade of dying sunlight cut straight through the haze of smoke hanging over the room. For a second, everything just stopped. Every rough, ink-covered face turned toward the doorway, and what they saw stopped the laughter cold. A girl, barely more than a kid, standing in the frame with the whole evening light behind her like a spotlight she never asked for. She couldn't have been older than 16, maybe 17 at most. The leather jacket hanging off her shoulders was clearly built for someone twice her size, the sleeves bunched up where she'd rolled them just to free her hands. Her sneakers were caked in dried mud, her jeans ripped at the knee in a way that wasn't fashion, just wear. Her hair was yanked back into a ponytail that had mostly given up holding its shape. She stood there for a beat too long, fingers curled into the collar of that oversized jacket like it was the only thing keeping her upright. The silence didn't last. It never does in a room full of men who've spent their whole lives daring the world to laugh first. A snort broke out from somewhere near the pool table, then another, and within seconds the whole bar was roaring, boots stomping the floor, bottles clinking together, someone letting out a whistle sharp enough to cut through the noise. At the head of the biggest table sat a mountain of a man they called Bear, arms folded across a chest wide enough to block a doorway. He leaned back in his chair, grinning around the toothpick in his mouth. "What is this?" he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Some kind of lost Girl Scout wander in here, looking for cookies money?" The laughter climbed even higher. But the girl didn't flinch. She didn't turn around and bolt back out into the parking lot the way half the room expected her to. She just stood there, breathing slow, deliberate, waiting the noise out like she'd rehearsed this exact moment 100 times in her head on the drive over. And that's when somebody near the bar actually looked, really looked, at the back of her jacket. The laughter died so fast it was almost violent, like someone had reached over and cut the sound out of the room entirely. The patch stitched across her shoulders wasn't new. The leather around it was cracked and faded from years of sun and road dust, the stitching gone soft with age. But the words were still legible if you knew what you were looking at. Steel Wolves. Charter Founder. That patch didn't come from a gift shop. It didn't come from some online knockoff store selling biker aesthetics to weekend riders. That patch belonged to the men who built this club from nothing, back before half the guys sitting in that room had ever swung a leg over a bike. It belonged to a name. The girl turned slowly, scanning the room until her eyes landed on Bear, and when she finally spoke, her voice shook. But she didn't try to hide it. "This was my dad's," she said. Jonah Reyes. If the room had gone quiet before, this was something else entirely. This was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind you could feel pressing against your chest. Jonah Reyes wasn't just a name to these men. He was a legend, stitched into the bones of the club itself, one of the founding writers, a man who never once hesitated when someone needed help, who'd built half the reputation this club still traded on. He died years back, pulling a family out of a burning car wreck on the interstate before the flames reached the gas tank. None of them had seen his daughter since they'd stood at his funeral, watching a kid barely old enough to understand what gone really meant. And now here she was, grown taller, standing in the same jacket he used to wear, filling a doorway the way he used to. Before we go further, if stories about second chances and quiet strength mean something to you, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps stories like this one reach more people who need a reminder that decency is still out there. Her name was Nora. She hadn't ridden 2 hours across the county just to relive old memories or bask in the weight of her father's legend. She was there because she needed help, and because she'd run out of every other option she could think of. Her mother's health had been declining for months, the medical bills stacking up faster than either of them could keep track of, and every door she'd knocked on in town had shut just a little too quickly, a little too politely. "I didn't know where else to go," she admitted, her voice barely above the hum of the jukebox in the corner. "My mom always told me, if things ever got bad enough, Dad's brothers wouldn't let us fall." Those words landed like something physical. You could see it move through the room, man to man, shoulders dropping, jaws tightening. The laughter from minutes ago felt like it belonged to a completely different night. These were grown men, hardened by decades on the road and years of living by their own code. And every single one of them suddenly looked like they'd been caught doing something they weren't proud of. Because they had made a promise once, back at that funeral, standing in the rain. They'd told Jonah's widow that his family would never be alone as long as the club still existed. And somewhere between then and now, life had gotten in the way. Jobs changed. People moved. Years slipped past the way they always do, quietly, without asking permission, until a promise that once felt unbreakable had faded into something nobody quite remembered making. Now his daughter was standing in the middle of their bar, wearing his colors, holding them accountable without ever once raising her voice. Bear was the first to move. The same man who'd cracked the loudest joke minutes earlier pushed his chair back and stood up slow, like his knees suddenly weighed more than they used to. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the mockery from before. "Kid," he said, "you should never have had to come here by yourself." He pulled his cap off and dragged a hand down his face, and around the room you could see the same realization hit man after man like dominoes falling. Something unspoken passed between them. No vote taken, no meeting called. Just an understanding that settled over the room, the way storm clouds settle over a valley before the rain actually starts. That night, Nora rode home in a convoy she never could have imagined walking through that door alone. A dozen engines thundering behind her, headlights slicing through the dark like the whole club had suddenly remembered exactly who they used to be. They didn't just patch a leaky roof or drop off a few groceries and call it done. They rebuilt the entire property from the ground up. By the next morning, neighbors were standing on their porches in disbelief, watching a small army of leather-clad bikers repainting fences, replacing rotted porch steps, hauling in bags of groceries like they were delivering for an army. For the first time in longer than Nora could remember, her mother stood in the doorway and actually smiled. But something bigger than repairs had shifted that night. Nora had become more than just a girl who showed up asking for help. She'd become a mirror the club hadn't realized it needed, a reminder of exactly who they used to be before pride and routine and the slow drift of time had buried the parts of themselves that once made them worth being afraid of and worth trusting all at once. The old loyalty that had been sitting dormant for years came roaring back almost overnight. The club started organizing charity runs again, the kind Jonah used to lead, delivering meals to families who couldn't make ends meet, raising money for veterans struggling to get back on their feet, showing up at children's hospitals in full colors just to make some kid's rough week a little brighter. And at the front of every single ride, cutting through the wind on her father's restored motorcycle, was Nora. The bike had sat untouched in someone's garage for years after Jonah passed, but the club brought it back to life piece by piece, the same way they'd brought themselves back to life in the process. Watching her ride at the head of that pack, young and unshaken, and carrying her father's name like it weighed nothing at all, gave the whole club something they hadn't realized they'd lost: purpose. People around town started calling her the Little Wolf, and the name stuck fast. Months later at the club's annual gathering, Bear approached her holding something wrapped carefully in cloth. Inside was a brand new patch, custom-stitched. The kind that doesn't get handed out lightly. It read Legacy Rider, and underneath, in smaller lettering, Daughter of Jonah Reyes. The room watched in complete silence as she sewed it onto the jacket right beside her father's original patch. Her hands steady, despite the tears. Most of the men in that room were trying hard not to show. When she finished, she looked up at all of them and offered a faint, tired smile. "My dad used to tell me the patch doesn't make you strong," she said quietly. "It just reminds you who you're riding for." Nobody said anything for a long moment. They didn't need to. Every man in that room understood, maybe for the first time in years, that what actually held this club together was never the leather or the engines or the reputation that scared strangers off the sidewalk. It was something a lot simpler than that. Loyalty that doesn't need an audience, and courage that doesn't need to be loud to matter. From that day forward, wherever the Steel Wolves rode, people noticed the young woman near the front of the pack, the one whose jacket told a story that spoke louder than any engine roaring down the highway. She wasn't just carrying her father's name anymore. She was building something of her own on top of it. Ride by ride, mile by mile. If this story landed with you, do us a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so we can keep bringing you real stories like this one. And before you go, I want to hear from you directly. What does loyalty actually mean to you? Has there ever been someone in your life whose quiet strength completely changed how you saw them? As the engines roared back to life and the convoy disappeared down the open road, the wind caught the edge of Nora's jacket, the two patches catching the last light of the afternoon sun side by side. A reminder that some promises, even the ones that seem to fade with time, are just waiting for the right person to walk through the door and remind everyone what they meant.